On a bustling Saturday afternoon at Riverside Shopping Center, Robert Chen had been managing the mall for over 15 years. He took pride in maintaining a welcoming environment for all visitors, regardless of their background or beliefs. His dedication to fairness had earned him respect from both shoppers and store owners alike. That particular day started like any other. Stores were busy with weekend shoppers, families enjoyed lunch at the food court, and the usual hum of commerce filled the air. Robert was making his routine rounds, checking in with store managers and ensuring everything ran smoothly. Little did he know, this ordinary day would soon become one of the most challenging of his career. Around 2 p.m., an unexpected commotion near the mall's main entrance caught his attention. A crowd had begun to gather, phones raised to capture whatever was unfolding. As Robert made his way through the growing mass of onlookers, he noticed a familiar face, one he'd seen countless times on television and social media. It was tech entrepreneur Thomas Barrett, known for his revolutionary electric car company and space exploration ventures. Barrett stood in the center of the gathering crowd, wearing a bright red baseball cap that had become a symbol of political division in recent years. While Robert had always maintained a strictly neutral stance on political matters within the mall, he couldn't ignore the tension building in the atmosphere. Some shoppers were approaching Barrett for selfies, while others were visibly uncomfortable with the situation. What happened next would test Robert's professional judgment and personal principles in ways he never expected. As the crowd grew larger, several shop owners approached him with concerns about potential disruptions to their business. The situation was quickly becoming more than just a celebrity sighting, it was turning into a security concern. Robert took a deep breath, remembering his training in conflict resolution. He knew that his next actions would need to balance the safety and comfort of all mall visitors with the rights of individuals to express themselves. The weight of this responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders as he prepared to address the situation. Moving through the crowd, Robert noticed the diverse reactions among the shoppers. An elderly couple watched from a bench, shaking their heads in disapproval. A group of teenagers excitedly shared photos on their phones. A mother hurriedly guided her children into a nearby store. The mall's atmosphere had shifted from casual weekend shopping to something more complex and charged. As Robert approached Barrett, he couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. Here was one of the world's wealthiest individuals, standing in a suburban mall, creating an unexpected crisis of policy and principle. The next few minutes would require all of Robert's experience and diplomacy to navigate this delicate situation while maintaining the peaceful atmosphere he'd worked so hard to cultivate over the years. Security cameras whirred overhead, recording every moment. Store employees watched from their entrances, wondering how this would play out. Robert straightened his tie and cleared his throat, knowing that his next words would need to be chosen very carefully. The eyes of hundreds were now upon him, waiting to see how he would handle this unprecedented situation in the otherwise ordinary shopping center. The air conditioning hummed steadily overhead, but Robert could feel beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Years of handling difficult situations had taught him that the first few words in any confrontation often set the tone for everything that follows. As he prepared to speak, he reminded himself that regardless of who stood before him, his duty remained the same, to ensure the safety and comfort of everyone in his mall. In this moment, Robert wasn't just facing a celebrity or a political statement, he was facing a test of his principles as a mall manager and as a person. The following events would not only challenge his professional judgment but would also spark a conversation about the balance between personal expression and public space management in modern America. As Robert approached Barrett, he noticed the tech billionaire was engaged in animated conversation with a small group of admirers. The security team, led by Officer David Thompson, had already positioned themselves strategically around the area, maintaining a watchful eye on the growing crowd. "Mr. Barrett," Robert began, his voice professional and measured. "I'm Robert Chen, the manager of Riverside Shopping Center. While we're honored by your visit, I need to discuss something with you." The businessman turned, his expression curious but guarded. The red cap gleamed under the mall's bright lights, almost seeming to pulse with the energy of the moment. What happened next would later be recounted differently by various witnesses. Barrett, known for his quick wit and unpredictable responses, smiled and said, "Let me guess, the hat's causing trouble?" His voice carried that familiar confident tone that millions had heard in viral videos and interviews. Robert maintained his composure, aware that dozens of phones were recording their interaction. "Sir, our mall policy focuses on creating a comfortable environment for all visitors. The current situation is creating challenges for our merchants and shoppers." He gestured discreetly to the growing crowd that had nearly blocked access to several stores. A nearby shop owner, Mrs. Patel from the family-owned jewelry store, watched nervously as potential customers struggled to reach her entrance. The weekend was typically her busiest time, and this impromptu gathering was affecting business across the mall. Barrett's response surprised everyone. Instead of becoming defensive or confrontational, he looked around thoughtfully, seeming to truly notice the impact of his presence for the first time. "You know," he said, "I came here to prove a point about freedom of expression, but I'm actually disrupting people's livelihoods, aren't I?" The crowd fell silent, phones still recording, waiting for what would happen next. Robert saw an opportunity to de-escalate the situation. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation in my office? Away from the main thoroughfare?" He gestured toward the administrative section of the mall. As they walked, the crowd began to disperse, though many lingered, discussing what they'd just witnessed. Security officers gently encouraged people to resume their shopping, while store owners breathed sighs of relief as normal foot traffic slowly resumed. In Robert's office, the conversation took an unexpected turn. Barrett removed his cap and placed it on the desk between them. "You know, I've been in hundreds of malls, but this is the first time a manager has approached me with such dignity." He leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking more like a regular person than the larger-than-life figure from the news. Robert shared his perspective on managing public spaces in divided times. "It's not about politics or personal beliefs," he explained. "It's about ensuring everyone can go about their day without feeling uncomfortable or hindered." He described the daily challenges of maintaining harmony in a space where thousands of people from different backgrounds converged. Barrett listened intently, occasionally nodding. The security cameras in Robert's office silently recorded this unlikely meeting, a billionaire and a mall manager having a genuine conversation about social responsibility and public spaces. Outside, social media was already buzzing with various versions of what had transpired. Some praised Robert's professional handling of the situation, while others criticized him for approaching Barrett at all. The incident was quickly becoming a trending topic, with people debating the balance between individual expression and community harmony. Mrs. Patel, who had worried about her sales being affected, was surprised to find her store suddenly bustling. The incident had drawn more people to the mall, and many were now browsing her jewelry collection while discussing the events they'd witnessed. As their conversation continued, Robert and Barrett found common ground in unexpected ways. They discussed the challenges of leadership, the importance of listening to different perspectives, and the impact of social media on public discourse. What had started as a potential confrontation was evolving into a meaningful dialogue about responsibility and mutual respect. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through Robert's office window as their discussion drew to a close. Barrett stood up, cap in hand, and extended his other hand to Robert. "You've given me something to think about," he said. "Sometimes making a point isn't worth the disruption it causes to ordinary people's lives." As they prepared to leave the office, both men knew that this incident would be remembered not for its conflict, but for how it was resolved. The mall's regular rhythm had been restored, but something had shifted in the atmosphere, a subtle reminder that even in the most unexpected situations, understanding and respect could prevail. The following morning, Robert arrived at the mall earlier than usual. As he pulled into his reserved parking spot, he noticed several news vans already stationed in the parking lot. His phone had been buzzing non-stop since videos of yesterday's incident went viral, with over 5 million views across various social media platforms. Inside his office, Robert found his inbox flooded with emails from national media outlets requesting interviews. The mall's public relations team, consisting of just one person, Linda from marketing, was overwhelmed with phone calls. What had seemed like a successfully resolved situation was now taking on a life of its own. The morning news shows were already running segments about the incident. Some praised it as a masterclass in conflict resolution, while others tried to spin it into a controversial story about freedom of expression in private spaces. Robert watched one clip where a panel of experts debated the implications of his actions, feeling surreal as they analyzed his every word and gesture. Around 9 a.m., the mall's owner, Mr. Reynolds, called from his vacation in Florida. "Chen, I've been watching the news. Never thought our little mall would make national headlines." His tone was hard to read. "Tell me honestly, how are you handling this?" Robert glanced through his office window at the growing media presence outside. "Sir, I handled it the way I've handled everything for the past 15 years, by putting the mall's community first." He explained his approach, emphasizing how he'd managed to protect both the businesses and Barrett's dignity. To his relief, Mr. Reynolds chuckled. "That's why we keep you around, Chen. But brace yourself, this story's got legs. The way you handled it, well, let's just say people aren't used to seeing conflicts resolved with respect these days." As the mall opened for business, something unexpected happened. Instead of the usual morning lull, shops reported record numbers of visitors. People were coming not just to shop, but to see the place where the viral incident had occurred. Mrs. Patel's jewelry store had a line forming outside, and the food court was buzzing with discussions about yesterday's events. Local residents who'd never paid much attention to the mall's management were now stopping Robert in the corridors to share their thoughts. An elderly gentleman approached him near the fountain. "Young man, I watched how you handled that situation. Reminded me of how we used to solve problems back in my day, with dignity and respect." By midday, Robert received an unexpected email from Barrett's office. The tech billionaire had posted a thoughtful reflection on social media about their conversation, praising Robert's approach and acknowledging the importance of considering how personal actions affect communities. The post was rapidly gaining attention, with business schools already requesting permission to use the incident as a case study in leadership and conflict resolution. The mall security team reported that visitors were taking selfies at the spot where the interaction had occurred. Officer Thompson joked that they might need to install a commemorative plaque. Boss, who knew doing the right thing could cause such a stir? Local business owners began reaching out to Robert for advice on handling difficult situations in their own establishments. A nearby shopping center's management team requested a training session on his approach to conflict resolution. The incident was evolving into a larger conversation about leadership in divided times. Linda from marketing was now fielding calls from business magazines and leadership podcasts. "Robert," she said, poking her head into his office, "I think we've accidentally created a movement here. People are calling it the Riverside approach to conflict resolution." As Robert took his lunch break in his office, he reflected on how a potentially volatile situation had transformed into something positive. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter in college. "Dad, my professor just used your video in our business ethics class. You're officially cooler than me now." The afternoon brought another surprise. Community leaders from neighboring cities began reaching out, asking Robert to speak at local events about maintaining unity in diverse communities. The mall's approach to handling differences was becoming a template for others to follow. Mr. Reynolds called again, this time with news. "Chen, the board is impressed. They want to implement your approach across all our properties. How do you feel about conducting some training sessions for other mall managers?" As the day wound down, Robert sat in his office, watching the sunset through his window. The media vans were still outside, but their presence seemed less intrusive now. He thought about how a simple commitment to treating people with respect had resonated with so many. The incident had tapped into something deeper than just a mall policy or a viral moment. It had reminded people that even in an age of division and viral confrontations, there was still room for dignity, understanding, and mutual respect. The Riverside Shopping Center had become more than just a place to shop, it was now a symbol of how communities could handle differences with grace. As he prepared to leave for the day, Robert noticed a small package on his desk. Inside was a note from Barrett's office, along with a baseball cap, not red this time, but a simple blue one with the mall's logo. The note read, "Sometimes the best statements we can make are the ones that bring people together. Thank you for the lesson in true leadership." A week after the incident, the Riverside Shopping Center had transformed in unexpected ways. The initial media frenzy had settled, but its effects continued to ripple through the community. Robert noticed subtle but significant changes in how people interacted within the mall's spaces. The food court, once just a place for quick meals, had become a hub for community dialogue. Local groups started gathering there for what they called common ground conversations, where people with different viewpoints could discuss issues respectfully. Robert observed these meetings from a distance, amazed at how the simple act of sharing a meal could bring people together. Mrs. Patel's jewelry store had seen a surprising transformation. She'd started hosting what she called "Story Behind the Stone" events, where customers shared personal stories while browsing. "Mr. Chen," she told Robert one morning, "people aren't just buying jewelry anymore, they're sharing their lives." That day changed everything. The mall's weekly management meeting took on a different tone too. Store owners who had barely spoken to each other before were now actively collaborating. The owner of the bookstore and the manager of the electronics shop had created a joint program called Tech Meets Tales, combining traditional storytelling with modern technology to attract younger customers. One Tuesday morning, Robert received an unexpected visit from the city mayor. "Your mall has become a model for our city," the mayor explained, settling into a chair in Robert's office. "We're seeing fewer conflicts in other shopping centers, parks, and public spaces. People keep referring to doing it the Riverside way." The security team reported a significant drop in incidents requiring intervention. Officer Thompson attributed it to what he called the ripple effect of that day. People saw how a potentially explosive situation was handled with respect, he explained during his daily briefing. Now they're mimicking that approach in their own interactions. Local businesses began sending their employees to the mall during lunch breaks, not just for shopping, but to observe and learn from the atmosphere. A regional bank manager commented that watching how the mall staff handled customer interactions had inspired them to revamp their own training programs. The mall's monthly newsletter, usually ignored by most visitors, became a sought-after publication. Linda had transformed it into a platform for sharing stories of positive interactions and community building. "People want to be part of this narrative," she explained to Robert. "They're not just reading about it, they're living it." Even the mall's physical space began to reflect the change. The formerly empty corner near the main entrance was converted into what became known as the Connection Corner, with comfortable seating and conversation-starting art pieces. Local artists contributed works that celebrated community and understanding. Barrett's influence continued to resonate. His tech company had launched a nationwide initiative called Community First, inspired by his experience at Riverside. The program provided grants to shopping centers and public spaces that demonstrated innovative approaches to community building. Riverside, naturally, was featured as the flagship example. Robert's daughter's college professor had developed a case study about the incident, which was now being taught in business schools across the country. Leadership in the age of viral moments, they called it. Robert found it somewhat amusing that his instinctive response to a challenging situation was being analyzed by future business leaders. The mall's cleaning staff reported an unexpected change too. "People are more considerate now," the head of housekeeping noted during a staff meeting. "They're cleaning up after themselves, helping others with heavy bags, holding doors open." It's like that one moment of respect sparked a chain reaction. As fall approached, the mall prepared for its annual community fair. This year's theme, naturally, was Building Bridges. Store owners competed to create the most innovative ways to bring different groups together. The toy store owner partnered with a senior center to create an intergenerational gaming event. The sports shop organized inclusive fitness classes that accommodated all ability levels. One afternoon, Robert found a group of teenagers studying in the food court. They were from the local high school's debate club, using the mall as a practice space for learning respectful disagreement. "We saw what happened with that billionaire," one student explained. "If people that different can find common ground, so can we." The impact extended beyond the mall's walls. Local news reported a decrease in confrontational incidents throughout the city. Community leaders attributed it to what they called the Riverside effect, the idea that treating others with respect, even in disagreement, could transform entire communities. As Robert walked through the mall one evening, he overheard snippets of conversations that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. People with opposing viewpoints were engaged in civil discussions. Store owners who had once competed fiercely were now collaborating on events. The space had become more than a shopping center, it was a living example of how community could thrive through understanding and respect. 1 month after the incident, Robert received an invitation that would take the Riverside story to an entirely new level. A prestigious business conference in Silicon Valley wanted him to deliver a keynote speech about transforming spaces of commerce into places of community. The invitation came with a personal note from Barrett himself: "Your story needs to reach more people. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the most wisdom." Robert had never been comfortable with public speaking, but he recognized the opportunity to share something valuable. As he prepared for the conference, he reflected on how the mall had continued to evolve. The changes weren't just superficial, they had become woven into the fabric of daily life. The mall's customer service desk, once purely functional, had transformed into what staff now called the Solutions Hub. When conflicts arose, they were handled with a new approach that prioritized understanding over enforcement. The security team had even created a training manual titled The Riverside Method, which was being requested by shopping centers across the country. Local schools began organizing field trips to the mall, not for shopping, but to observe and learn about community interaction. A high school sociology teacher brought her students to study what she called practical conflict resolution in action. The teenagers, initially skeptical, found themselves drawn into the mall's transformed atmosphere. Mrs. Patel's jewelry store had become a case study in business adaptation. She'd started hosting monthly, Community Gems, events, where local residents shared stories of bringing people together. Each storyteller received a small piece of jewelry, not valuable in terms of money, but priceless in terms of meaning. "Every piece now carries a story of unity," she explained to curious customers. The food court vendors noticed an interesting trend. People weren't just grabbing quick meals anymore, they were intentionally sitting with strangers, starting conversations. The Chinese restaurant owner and the Mexican food stall operator created a fusion menu called Bridging Flavors, which became an unexpected hit and a symbol of cultural collaboration. Robert's preparation for the conference was interrupted by an unexpected visitor, a sociology professor from a nearby university. She had been studying the mall's transformation and had documented what she called the ripple effect of respectful resolution. Her research showed how the incident had influenced not just the mall, but the surrounding community's approach to conflict. The local Chamber of Commerce reported that businesses near the mall had started adopting similar approaches to customer service and conflict resolution. A nearby car dealership had completely revamped its sales process, focusing on building understanding rather than pushing sales. Their customer satisfaction scores had skyrocketed. As Robert worked on his speech, he received daily updates about how the mall's story was inspiring others. A shopping center in Texas had created a community-first program based on Riverside's model. A mall in Florida had transformed its empty spaces into conversation corners, where people could engage in respectful dialogue. The mall's maintenance staff reported another unexpected change. The amount of litter had decreased significantly, and instances of vandalism had dropped to almost zero. "It's like people finally feel ownership of this space," the head of maintenance observed. "They're treating it like their community living room." Local politicians, noticing the mall's success, began holding informal town halls in the food court. These weren't campaign events but genuine listening sessions where officials and citizens could have real conversations about community needs. The mall had become a neutral ground where different viewpoints could coexist respectfully. Barrett's tech company had followed through on its Community First initiative, launching a mobile app that helped other shopping centers implement similar programs. Robert found himself consulting on the project, offering insights about how physical spaces could foster digital community building. The mall's quarterly financial reports revealed something interesting. While foot traffic had increased significantly, the nature of visits had changed. People weren't just coming to shop, they were coming to connect. Store owners reported that customers were spending more time in their shops, engaging in conversations, and making more meaningful purchases. As Robert finalized his conference speech, he struggled to capture the essence of what had happened. How could he explain that a potentially controversial moment had transformed into a movement? The answer came from an unexpected source, a young barista at the mall's coffee shop. "You know what's different now," she told him while preparing his usual morning coffee. "People come here expecting to connect. It's not just about what they're buying, it's about who they might meet, what conversations they might have. That day with the billionaire? It just showed us what was possible." That insight became the cornerstone of Robert's speech. The mall hadn't just changed its policies or procedures, it had changed people's expectations of what could happen in a public space. The simple act of handling one tense moment with respect had opened the door to countless other moments of connection and understanding. The night before leaving for the conference, Robert walked through the mall after closing time. The empty corridors echoed with the day's conversations, discussions between strangers who became friends, debates that ended in handshakes, and moments of unexpected connection. What had started as a potential crisis had become a blueprint for community transformation, one interaction at a time. The Silicon Valley Conference Center buzzed with energy as Robert prepared for his keynote speech. Looking out at the audience from backstage, he saw faces he'd only seen in business magazines, tech executives, retail giants, and community leaders from across the globe. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie, the same one he'd worn during his interaction with Barrett. Linda from marketing had helped him prepare a presentation, but as he waited to be introduced, Robert decided to do something different. He'd tell the story the way it had actually happened, not as a carefully crafted business strategy, but as a human moment that had sparked unexpected change. The conference moderator's voice filled the auditorium. "Our next speaker showed us that in an age of viral confrontations, there's still room for dignity and understanding. Please welcome Robert Chen from the Riverside Shopping Center." As Robert walked onto the stage, he carried with him something unexpected, the blue cap with the mall's logo that Barrett had sent him. He placed it on the podium, took a deep breath, and began not with prepared remarks, but with a simple truth. "I'm not here to tell you about management strategies or conflict resolution techniques," he said. "I'm here to tell you about what happens when we remember that behind every potential conflict, there are real people with real stories." The audience leaned forward as Robert shared the details that hadn't made it into the viral videos, the worried look on Mrs. Patel's face as she watched her customers unable to reach her store, the elderly couple on the bench who had seen decades of social changes, the young security officer who had positioned himself to protect everyone involved. Robert's voice grew stronger as he described the moment in his office with Barrett. "We didn't solve the world's problems that day," he admitted. But we showed that when we approach each other as people first, something remarkable happens. We start seeing possibilities instead of divisions. During the Q&A session, a retail executive asked about implementing similar approaches in other locations. Robert's response surprised many: "Don't try to copy what we did. Instead, listen to your community. Every space has its own rhythm, its own needs." Our success came from recognizing and respecting that. A tech startup founder asked about measuring success. Robert smiled and shared a story about the young barista who had captured the essence of their transformation. "Some changes can't be measured in metrics," he explained. "They're measured in moments, in conversations that wouldn't have happened before, in connections that weren't possible until people felt safe enough to reach out." During the lunch break, Robert found himself surrounded by conference attendees eager to share their own experiences. A mall manager from Seattle described how she'd been struggling with similar issues. A community organizer from Chicago wanted to know more about creating spaces for difficult conversations. Barrett made a surprise appearance at the conference, joining Robert for an impromptu panel discussion. The two men, now comfortable in each other's presence, shared insights about how their unexpected encounter had changed their perspectives on leadership and community building. "Robert taught me something valuable that day," Barrett admitted to the audience. "Sometimes our biggest impact comes not from making bold statements, but from how we handle quiet moments of potential conflict." As the conference continued, Robert noticed something interesting happening in the hallways and breakout sessions. People weren't just discussing business strategies, they were sharing stories about their own communities, their own challenges, and their hopes for creating more connected spaces. A real estate developer approached Robert with an innovative proposal. He wanted to design a new kind of shopping center, one that intentionally incorporated spaces for community dialogue and connection. "Your story made me realize we've been building walls when we should have been building bridges," he explained. During an afternoon workshop, Robert worked with a group of mall managers to help them identify opportunities for transformation in their own spaces. One manager shared how a coffee shop in her mall had become a de facto community center. Another described how a simple change in seating arrangements had led to more interactions between different community groups. The conference organizers had set up a live stream of the event, and Robert received messages from mall employees back home about how proud they were to see their story reaching a global audience. Officer Thompson sent a photo of the security team gathered around a computer, watching the live stream during their break. As the day wound down, Robert participated in a closing panel titled "The Future of Public Spaces." The discussion ranged from architecture to technology, but kept returning to a central theme: the importance of creating environments where human connection could flourish. A young architect in the audience asked what seemed like a simple question: "What's the most important design element for fostering community?" Robert thought about the various changes they'd made at Riverside, but his answer was unexpected. "Empty space," he replied. "Room for possibility. Sometimes the most important thing we can design is the space between, the places where connections can happen naturally." The conference concluded with an announcement that surprised Robert. The organizers had created a new annual award, the Riverside Innovation in Community Building Award, to recognize spaces that successfully fostered connection and understanding across social divides. As Robert packed up his materials, he found a note left on the podium. It was from a high school student who had been part of a youth leadership program at the conference. "Thank you for showing us that change doesn't always need grand gestures. Sometimes it just needs someone brave enough to see people as people." Returning from the conference, Robert found himself viewing the Riverside Shopping Center through fresh eyes. What had once seemed like ordinary spaces now held deeper meaning. The morning sun streaming through the skylight illuminated more than just the polished floors, it highlighted countless small moments of human connection happening throughout the mall. The impact of his conference speech had spread faster than anyone anticipated. News outlets were running features about what they called the Riverside Revolution in retail spaces. But the real changes were happening quietly, in the daily interactions that rarely made headlines. A group of international urban planners visited the mall to study its layout and atmosphere. Robert watched as they took notes about things he'd never consciously planned: how the arrangement of benches encouraged conversation, how the lighting created comfortable spaces for people to gather, how even the background music seemed to foster a sense of calm and connection. Mrs. Patel's jewelry store had become a case study in community-centered business. She'd started hosting monthly Unity markets, where local artisans could showcase their work alongside her regular inventory. "It's not just about selling anymore," she told Robert. "It's about creating connections that last longer than any purchase." The food court had evolved into what regular visitors now called the community table. Restaurant owners noticed that customers were regularly leaving empty seats at their tables, intentionally making space for others to join them. Small signs appeared on tables: "Friends welcome, let's share a meal and a story." One morning, Robert arrived to find a film crew setting up in the mall's central courtyard. A documentary team was creating a series about spaces that were bridging social divides. "Your mall isn't just a shopping center," the director explained. "It's become a blueprint for how public spaces can heal community divisions." The security team's approach had gained national attention. Officer Thompson was invited to police departments across the country to share their preventive approach to conflict resolution. "We're not just preventing problems," he explained during a training session. "We're creating an environment where problems are less likely to arise in the first place." Local schools had incorporated the mall into their curriculum in unexpected ways. A high school psychology class conducted a study on how physical spaces influenced human behavior. An elementary school art teacher brought students to sketch people interacting in the food court, capturing moments of connection on paper. The mall's weekly newsletter, once focused solely on sales and events, had transformed into a community journal. Linda had created a section called Riverside Stories, where visitors shared moments of unexpected connection they'd experienced in the mall. The submissions poured in faster than she could process them. Barrett's influence continued to grow in unexpected ways. His tech company had developed an app that helped businesses track not just sales metrics, but also connection metrics, measuring things like customer interaction time, community event participation, and positive social media sentiment. Riverside was the first to pilot the program. Robert received an email from a mall manager in Singapore who had implemented similar changes after watching his conference speech online. She shared photos of their transformed space and wrote about how the simple act of intentionally creating opportunities for connection had changed their entire community dynamic. The mall's annual budget meeting took an interesting turn when Mr. Reynolds announced a new investment category: community infrastructure. This included funding for more comfortable seating areas, better acoustics for conversation spaces, and technology to help people connect with community resources. A university research team began a long-term study of what they called the Riverside Effect. They were tracking how changes in the mall's environment influenced everything from customer behavior to community health indicators. Early results showed decreased stress levels among regular visitors and increased reports of social connection. The maintenance staff had become unexpected ambassadors for the mall's philosophy. They shared stories of how visitors would stop them to talk, not just about spills or repairs, but about their lives. The head of maintenance created a board in their break room where staff could post stories of meaningful interactions they'd witnessed or experienced. One afternoon, Robert overheard a conversation between two teenagers sitting near the fountain. "This is the only place where my grandparents will hang out with me and my friends," one said. "Something about this place makes everyone feel comfortable, you know?" The mall's parking lot attendants reported an interesting trend: people were arriving earlier and staying later. Not for shopping, but for what one attendant called mall walks with a purpose, intentional time spent in an environment where unexpected connections were not just possible, but probable. Local business owners started asking about franchising the Riverside approach. Robert had to explain that what made their space special couldn't be franchised, it had to grow organically from each community's unique needs and character. Instead of selling a system, he began offering guidance on how to listen to and serve their own communities. As autumn approached, the mall prepared for its traditional holiday season transformation. But this year was different. Instead of focusing solely on sales and decorations, store owners collaborated on creating what they called connection corners, spaces where holiday shoppers could pause, rest, and engage with others in meaningful ways. 1 year after the incident that changed everything, Robert stood in the center of Riverside Shopping Center, watching the early morning light filter through the newly installed skylights. The mall was quiet before opening, but evidence of its transformation was everywhere, from the thoughtfully arranged seating areas to the community bulletin boards filled with stories of connection. Today was special. The mall was hosting its first Community Connection Summit, bringing together business leaders, community organizers, and everyday citizens to share their experiences of how public spaces could foster understanding. The event had started as a small gathering but had grown into something much larger, with participants coming from across the country. Barrett was scheduled to give the opening address, not as a tech billionaire, but as someone who had learned valuable lessons about community impact. He'd arrived early, walking the mall's corridors with Robert, both men reflecting on how a potentially divisive moment had sparked such positive change. "You know what's remarkable?" Barrett said, pausing near the spot where their first interaction had occurred. "We never set out to create a movement. We just chose to see each other as people first." Robert nodded, remembering the tension of that day and the unexpected turn it had taken. The mall's transformation had exceeded everyone's expectations. The quarterly financial reports showed something fascinating. While traditional retail metrics remained strong, the real growth was in what they now called community value indicators. People weren't just coming to shop, they were coming to belong. Mrs. Patel's jewelry store had become a model for community-centered business. She'd recently won a National Retail Innovation Award for her Stories Behind the Stones program, which had inspired similar initiatives across the country. "When you create space for people to share their stories," she told a documentary crew, "the merchandise becomes secondary to the memories." The food court, now known as Community Table Square, had been featured in urban planning journals. The simple act of encouraging shared meals between strangers had created countless connections. Regular visitors told stories of job opportunities found, friendships formed, and even a few marriages that had started with simple lunch conversations. Officer Thompson had developed a training program that was being adopted by shopping centers nationwide. "Security isn't just about preventing problems," he explained during a morning briefing. "It's about creating an environment where everyone feels safe enough to be their authentic selves." The mall's maintenance team had become known as the Connection Crew, their uniforms now bearing the slogan "Building Community, One Space at a Time." They'd noticed that when people felt ownership of a space, they naturally took better care of it. Reports of vandalism had dropped to near zero. Linda from marketing had published a book titled The Riverside Way: How One Mall's Story Changed Community Building. It wasn't just about their experience, it included stories from spaces around the world that had been inspired by their approach. The book had become required reading in several university urban planning programs. As summit attendees began arriving, Robert noticed something remarkable. People from different backgrounds, beliefs, and communities were naturally gravitating toward each other, starting conversations before the formal sessions had even begun. The mall's atmosphere had created what one sociologist called a neutral ground for authentic connection. Barrett's opening speech touched on themes that went beyond business or technology. What happened here at Riverside wasn't about retail strategy or conflict resolution techniques, he said. It was about remembering that beneath our differences, we all share a basic human need for connection and understanding. Throughout the day, workshop sessions filled the mall's spaces. Store owners shared how they'd transformed their businesses from transaction-focused to relationship-centered. Community leaders discussed how they'd adapted the Riverside approach to their own unique contexts. Young entrepreneurs presented innovations in what they called connection technology. Robert participated in a panel discussion about the future of public spaces. When asked about the key to Riverside success, his answer surprised many: "We didn't try to force connection, we just created spaces where it could happen naturally." Sometimes the most powerful changes come from simply making room for possibility. As the summit continued, stories emerged of how the Riverside approach had influenced spaces far beyond shopping centers. Schools had redesigned their common areas to foster better student interaction. Hospitals had transformed their waiting rooms into community connection points. Even office buildings had begun incorporating principles of community-centered design. The day concluded with an unexpected announcement. A foundation had been created, funded by Barrett and other business leaders, dedicated to transforming public spaces into centers of community connection. The first grant would go to helping smaller communities implement what had become known as the Riverside model. That evening, after the summit concluded, Robert walked through the mall one last time. Tomorrow, he would begin a new chapter, having accepted a position as executive director of the new foundation. Mr. Reynolds had initially been reluctant to let him go but understood that Robert's experience needed to be shared more broadly. Near the fountain, he found Mrs. Patel closing her store. She smiled and handed him a small package. Inside was a simple silver pendant engraved with the words, "Every space is a story." It was, she explained, the first piece in a new collection inspired by Riverside's journey. As Robert prepared to leave, he noticed a young family sitting on one of the benches, sharing stories and laughter. They didn't know they were sitting in the exact spot where, a year ago, a potential confrontation had transformed into an opportunity for understanding. But they were living proof that when spaces are designed for connection, people naturally find ways to come together. The mall would continue to evolve, but its core message would remain the same. In a world often divided by differences, spaces that encourage understanding and connection are more valuable than ever. What had started as a moment of potential conflict had become a blueprint for how communities could bridge divides, one conversation at a time.